I am Clara, 33 years old, and my brother thought it was hilarious to humiliate my 7-year-old son in front of 200 wealthy guests. He dropped a cold, wrinkled hot dog onto my little boy's plate, while the children at the next table were served $67 Wagyu steaks. My mother scoffed and told me I should have packed a lunchbox, reminding everyone that my brother paid for this luxury out of his own pocket. I did not cry and I did not scream. I just dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin, smiled at them, and calmly said, "Noted." They had absolutely no idea that the waiter standing behind them worked for me, or that I owned the very building we were sitting in. Before I tell you exactly how I turned their dream wedding into a federal crime scene, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family is about respect, not blood. The Magnolia Estate was the absolute crown jewel of Connecticut wedding venues. It featured vaulted glass ceilings, imported crystal chandeliers, and a sweeping view of a private lake that glowed under the evening sunset. Tonight was the rehearsal dinner for my older brother Jason, who was 35, and the undisputed golden boy of our family. He was marrying Naomi, a 32-year-old micro-influencer from a highly affluent African-American family based in Atlanta. Naomi's family occupied the center of the grand dining room. Her parents, uncles, and aunts were draped in designer clothing, exuding the kind of effortless generational wealth that my mother Patricia had spent her entire life trying desperately to imitate. My mother sat at the head table, practically vibrating with pride. She was wearing a dress she had definitely put on a high-interest credit card just to keep up appearances with Naomi's relatives, projecting an image of high society that we simply did not belong to. I was seated at table 19. It was the very last table in the room, tucked neatly next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. My seat was positioned so that every time a waiter pushed through the doors, a gust of cold air hit my back. I sat there, holding the hand of my 7-year-old son Leo. We watched as a small army of white-gloved servers brought out the first course for Naomi's side of the family. The air filled with the rich, savory scent of seared Wagyu beef, truffle, mashed potatoes, and butter-poached asparagus. Leo watched with wide eyes as Naomi's nieces and nephews, sitting just one table over, eagerly dug into their gourmet meals. He looked up at me, his stomach giving a soft rumble, and asked when our food would arrive. That was when Jason approached our table. He did not bring a silver platter. He carried a cheap white paper plate that stood out glaringly against the imported silk tablecloths. On it lay a single boiled hot dog inside a stale bun without even a drop of ketchup or mustard. He tossed the paper plate onto the table right in front of Leo. "We did not order a plate for your son," Jason said loudly, ensuring that the surrounding tables could hear him clearly over the soft jazz music playing in the background. The catering budget was tight, and kids his age do not appreciate fine dining anyway. "Eat up, buddy." He offered a condescending pat on Leo's head. Leo shrank back into his chair, looking down at the wrinkled meat. I felt a familiar protective rage ignite in my chest. For 33 years, I had been the family scapegoat, forced to sacrifice my own comfort so Jason could shine. But I kept my face entirely blank. Naomi, sitting at the head table, caught my eye and offered a sickly sweet, pitying smile before turning her phone camera back to her own face to continue live streaming her luxurious evening to her thousands of followers. My mother Patricia marched over to our table to stand beside Jason. She looked down her nose at me, her 62-year-old face pulled into a tight frown of disapproval. "You really should have packed him something, Clara," she announced, her voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "You know how hard Jason and Naomi worked to afford all of this. Being a single mother means you need to plan ahead. You cannot just expect a free ride at an exclusive event. The humiliation was calculated, designed to show Naomi's high society family that I was the poor, struggling sister who relied on charity, while Jason was the self-made king who provided for everyone." A few guests from Atlanta glanced over, shaking their heads in quiet judgment, muttering to each other about my apparent lack of responsibility. In the past, a toxic comment like that would have made me gather my things and run to the parking lot in tears. I would have internalized their abuse, convinced myself I was the failure they claimed I was, and apologized for ruining their evening. But I was not the scared, people-pleasing scapegoat anymore. As a senior financial advisor, I dealt with corporate sharks every single day. I knew how to read a room, and more importantly, I knew how to hold my cards close to my chest. I looked at the pathetic hot dog, then looked up at my brother's smug face, and finally at my mother's judging eyes. I reached over, gently pushed the paper plate away from Leo, and looked directly into Jason's eyes. "Noted," I said softly. My voice was completely steady, devoid of any emotion. Jason smirked, assuming he had won, and turned to walk back to his champagne tower. He felt like the ultimate provider, a man displaying his dominance and wealth. He did not notice the general manager of the Magnolia estate, a man named David, standing just a few feet away near the kitchen doors. David made brief eye contact with me, his face a mask of strict professionalism. I gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. He nodded back, turning on his heel to head toward the administrative offices to execute the exact orders I had given him earlier that afternoon. Jason and Patricia thought they were putting me in my place, cementing my role as the family failure. They had absolutely no clue that the financial guillotine they had built for themselves was about to drop. The memory of how this entire nightmare began played vividly in my mind as I watched my brother Jason strut confidently back to his table. It started exactly 3 weeks before the rehearsal dinner inside my own living room. I lived in a comfortable, quiet apartment in the city, a sanctuary I paid for entirely on my own. It was a Saturday morning and I was helping Leo with a science project when heavy, demanding knocks rattled my front door. I opened it to find Jason and our mother Patricia standing in the hallway looking completely out of place. Patricia immediately stepped inside, without waiting for an invitation, her eyes sweeping over my modest furniture with a familiar look of absolute disdain. Jason followed closely behind, checking his luxury watch, and sighing loudly, acting as if stepping into my home was an unbearable chore he had to endure. They sat on my sofa, uninvited. Patricia smoothed her designer skirt and cleared her throat, adopting the exact tone she always used when she was about to demand a massive sacrifice from me. She announced that Jason and Naomi were facing some unexpected financial hurdles. Naomi's family in Atlanta was accustomed to a certain standard of excellence, Patricia explained, waving her hand dismissively at my simple decor. They were flying up dozens of high society guests, and the wedding budget had expanded significantly to accommodate their luxurious tastes. Jason crossed his arms and added that Naomi desperately wanted a 4-week honeymoon in the Maldives, complete with overwater bungalows, private chefs, and daily yacht charters. I stood in my kitchen pouring a glass of water and waited for the punchline. I knew perfectly well that my mother never visited me just to share Jason's extravagant travel itinerary. Patricia finally delivered the toxic demand. She told me that as a sister it was my duty to step up and ensure the family maintained a strong, wealthy image. She stated quite casually that they needed a $10,000 contribution from me for the honeymoon fund. I almost dropped my glass on the hardwood floor. I stared at them, completely stunned by their sheer audacity. $10,000 was a massive amount of money. I asked them why on earth I should pay for a luxury vacation I was not even formally invited to. Jason rolled his eyes, groaning and muttering that I was always so incredibly selfish and completely unsupportive of his happiness. Patricia leaned forward, using her classic psychological manipulation to corner me. She lowered her voice, feigning sympathy, and told me that my status as a single mother was a constant source of deep embarrassment for the entire family. She said Naomi's relatives were highly respected, traditional, wealthy people in Atlanta. According to my mother, my lack of a husband and my perceived financial struggles were a dark stain on Jason's big day. She claimed that by paying the $10,000, I would essentially be compensating the family for the immense shame I caused them on a daily basis. She actually used the word compensating. She spun a twisted narrative where I owed them this money simply for existing and making Jason look bad by comparison. I felt a familiar burning heat rising in my chest, but I absolutely refused to give them the emotional reaction they craved. I set my glass down on the granite counter with a sharp clink. I looked straight into my mother's eyes and told her my answer was no. I explained clearly that my money belonged to me and my son. I was raising Leo entirely on my own, paying for his school, his clothes, his medical bills, and his future. I had zero intention of funding a tropical getaway for a grown brother who never even remembered my birthday. Jason scoffed loudly, standing up and towering over me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. He said I was just bitterly jealous because Naomi was a highly successful influencer, while I was a pathetic nobody. Patricia stood up as well, her face flushing bright red with pure anger. She decided to use her ultimate weapon against me. If I did not write that $10,000 check immediately, she threatened Leo would be permanently banned from the wedding. She crossed her arms tightly and stated that Naomi felt Leo would be a massive disruption anyway. Naomi had apparently complained that a 7-year-old boy without a father would completely ruin the curated high-class aesthetic of her wedding photos. Patricia coldly informed me that unless I paid up right then and there, my son would not be welcome at the ceremony or the reception. They fully expected me to crumble. They expected me to panic cry and reach for my checkbook to buy my son's way into their exclusive family event. They vastly underestimated the woman I had become. I walked directly to my front door and pulled it wide open. I pointed out into the hallway and told them to get out of my home immediately. Patricia gasped, clutching her expensive pearls in mock horror, asking how I dared speak to my own mother that way. I kept my arm extended toward the door and replied that if they thought my own son was a disruption, they absolutely did not deserve his presence. I told Jason he could fund his own luxurious lifestyle instead of begging his single sister for financial handouts. Jason sneered viciously, warning me that I would severely regret disrespecting them. I did not flinch or back down. I just stared them down until they finally walked out into the corridor, muttering insults under their breath. I slammed the door shut and locked the deadbolt firmly. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs, but my mind was remarkably clear. I had drawn a massive, unbreakable line in the sand. I walked back into the living room, taking a deep, steadying breath to calm my nerves. The apartment was quiet and safe again. Then the heavy silence was shattered by a harsh, vibrating noise coming from the kitchen counter. My phone screen lit up with a blaring red icon. It was a critical alert from my premium credit monitoring application. I picked up the device, expecting a minor security flag or a routine system update. Instead, the notification read that a major inquiry and a massive new line of credit had just been officially approved under my Social Security number. The amount displayed on the screen made my blood run entirely cold. It was not a small credit card application or a minor banking error. Someone had successfully weaponized my pristine financial history. The alert detailed a catastrophic breach of my personal data originating from an IP address I recognized all too well. The family that had just called me a failure had decided to help themselves to my life. I stared at the glowing screen, the red alert reflecting in my eyes. The family that had just called me a failure decided to help themselves to my life. I did not scream or throw the device. Panic is a luxury for people who do not know how to fight back. As a senior financial advisor managing multi-million-dollar portfolios, I dealt with financial anomalies daily. I walked calmly to my home office, locked the door, and booted up my encrypted workstation. I logged directly into my secure financial portals, bypassing standard consumer interfaces to access raw data feeds. My pristine credit score, a number I meticulously built and protected for over a decade, plummeted overnight. It dropped by more than 100 points. A massive personal loan of $150,000 was fully approved and dispersed under my Social Security number. I pulled up the origination documents, my fingers flying across the keyboard with cold precision. I went straight into forensic mode, diving deep into the digital metadata attached to the loan application. I traced the origination IP address. It mapped perfectly to the Wi-Fi network at my parents' suburban house in Connecticut. I pulled the digital signature logs. The application was signed electronically at 2 in the morning, a time when I was sound asleep in my bed. I scrutinized the employment verification forms submitted to the lender. Someone forged a letter verifying my income utilizing old pay stubs stolen from my mail months ago. I kept digging, tracing the banking routing numbers involved in the transaction. The loan was structured with Jason listed as the primary borrower. Because Jason was a serial debtor with a ruined credit history, no reputable bank would ever lend him a dime. To bypass the bank's strict underwriting algorithms, the application featured a guarantor. The guarantor was me. My mother, Patricia, used my social security number, my clean financial background, and my hard-earned professional reputation to act as a fraudulent co-signer for her golden boy. She literally stole my identity to finance his lifestyle. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. Patricia sat on my sofa 10 minutes earlier, demanding a $10,000 handout and calling me a failure, all while knowing she had already stolen 15 times that amount in my name. She threatened to ban my son from the wedding, to punish me for not giving her pocket change perfectly secure, knowing she had already robbed my future to fund Jason's illusion of wealth. She thought I was just a naive, exhausted single mother who would not notice the missing funds until it was too late. She severely underestimated the financial predator she created. I tracked the final wire transfer to see exactly where my stolen future had been deposited. The loan funds had not gone into Jason's personal checking account. They had not been routed to Patricia's savings. The digital trail led directly to a high-yield corporate holding account. I ran a search on the routing and account numbers, cross-referencing them with state business registries. The beneficiary name populated on my screen in stark black letters: the Magnolia Estate, the ultra-luxury wedding venue hosting Jason and Naomi's extravagant event. The $150,000 was wired directly to the venue to cover the exorbitant costs of Naomi's dream wedding. My stolen identity paid for imported floral arches. My compromised credit funded the vintage champagne Naomi's high society Atlanta family would sip. My financial security bought the Wagyu beef live entertainment and flawless aesthetic Naomi demanded. They built their perfect wealthy influencer image entirely on my back. The ultimate betrayal was cemented in indisputable digital ink. Patricia and Jason committed a severe federal crime. Identity theft and wire fraud on this scale carried mandatory minimum sentencing. They crossed a line from toxic family dynamics into outright felony territory. They actively chose to jeopardize my ability to buy a house, secure loans for my son's future education, or pass standard background checks, all to ensure Naomi's relatives believed Jason was a self-made millionaire. I sat back in my desk chair, the monitors casting long shadows across my office. My breathing was slow and measured. The anger I felt was no longer a hot, blinding rage. It crystallized into something entirely different. It was pure, freezing determination. I downloaded every document, IP log, routing number, and forged signature. I compiled the evidence into an encrypted file on an external hard drive. I created triple backups, sending one to a secure cloud server and locking another in my safe. I was building a cage of evidence so strong that no amount of narcissistic gaslighting or familial guilt-tripping could ever break them out of it. I looked at the clock. The wedding was exactly 3 weeks away. I could have picked up the phone, dialed emergency services, and had police knocking on my parents' front door before dinner. I could have frozen the transaction, alerted the fraud department, and shut down the wedding preparations instantly. But that would be a quiet resolution. That would give Patricia the opportunity to cry, play the victim, claim it was a misunderstanding, and beg for family forgiveness behind closed doors. That would allow Naomi to walk away with her flawless reputation intact, pretending she knew nothing about the stolen money. I wanted a public execution. I wanted them standing at the altar, surrounded by the Atlanta socialites they were desperate to impress, believing they had completely got away with their crime. I wanted them to reach the absolute peak of their arrogant delusion before pulling the ground out from under them. Bypassing the police department entirely, I reached for my cell phone. I scrolled through encrypted professional contacts and stopped at the most ruthless corporate defense attorney in Connecticut. He specialized in white-collar crime and possessed a reputation for destroying fraudsters in federal court without mercy. I pressed call, listening to the dial tone ring in my silent office. ready to initiate the total destruction of my family's fraudulent empire. I pressed call, listening to the dial tone ring in my silent office, ready to initiate the total destruction of my family's fraudulent empire. Harrison picked up on the second ring. His voice was sharp, a gravelly baritone accustomed to tearing apart hostile witnesses and shredding corporate contracts. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed an emergency consultation regarding a six-figure federal fraud case, and the perpetrators were my own immediate family. He told me to be at his office in downtown Hartford first thing Monday morning. The law firm of Harrison and Vance occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass tower. Walking into his corner suite felt like stepping into an executioner's chamber. There were no warm family photos on his desk, only leather-bound legal volumes and a panoramic view of the city below. Harrison sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his eyes evaluating me with cold, predatory intelligence. I sat down across from him and placed my encrypted external hard drive directly on the polished wood surface. I handed him a printed dossier containing the raw data I had compiled. Harrison put on his reading glasses and opened the file. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the cavernous office was the turning of pages and the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I watched his eyes scan the IP logs, the routing numbers, and the forged electronic signatures. I watched him trace the flow of $150,000 from my stolen identity straight into the corporate accounts of the Magnolia estate. When he finally closed the folder, he took off his glasses and let out a low, impressed whistle. "They were incredibly sloppy," Harrison stated, tapping his heavy gold pen against the file. "Leaving a digital trail this wide open is amateurish. Patricia acting as a fraudulent guarantor using your social security number constitutes aggravated identity theft. Routing the illegally obtained funds across state lines to a vendor elevates this to federal wire fraud." He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Clara, the federal implications here are massive. Given the dollar amount and the premeditated nature of the crime, we are looking at a minimum of 10 years in federal prison for both your brother and your mother." I absorbed the information without flinching. 10 years. A decade behind bars for a single day of fake luxury. I nodded slowly, confirming I understood the severity of the situation. Harrison picked up his office phone. He advised me to call the police right this second. He wanted to contact the fraud division of the FBI, freeze the remaining funds at the venue, and dispatch officers to my parents' house in Connecticut before they could destroy any physical evidence. He told me that moving swiftly was the best way to secure my credit and mitigate the financial damage. I reached across the desk and gently pressed my hand over the phone receiver, stopping him. I told him no. Harrison looked at me, his sharp eyes narrowing in confusion. He reminded me that every day the loan sat active, my financial reputation remained severely compromised. I looked back at him with absolute, unwavering resolve. I explained that if we called the police today, my family would easily spin the narrative. Patricia would immediately burst into tears, claim she was simply confused by the digital forms, and act like a desperate mother trying to help her son. Jason would play the victim, claiming he intended to pay me back, and that I was just being a vindictive, jealous sister. Naomi would be the biggest winner in a quiet arrest. If we shut down the wedding now, she would play the tragic bride. She would go on her social media platforms, weep to her thousands of followers, and claim her dream was stolen by her fiancé's cruel, unsupportive family. Her wealthy Atlanta relatives would rally around her, completely oblivious to the fact that their daughter's extravagant lifestyle was funded by felony theft. They would all escape the true consequences of their actions. I refused to let that happen. I outlined my strategy to Harrison. I wanted them to stand at the altar. I wanted Patricia wearing her expensive, fraudulently funded gown. I wanted Jason to feel the ultimate pride of showing off wealth he never earned. I wanted Naomi's entire high society family to fly up from Atlanta, check into their luxury hotels, and take their seats in the grand ballroom. I wanted them to eat the Wagyu beef and drink the vintage champagne. I wanted them to reach the absolute pinnacle of their arrogant delusion surrounded by everyone they ever wanted to impress. And then I wanted to burn their entire facade to the ground. Harrison stared at me for a long moment. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his leather chair, clearly appreciating the sheer ruthlessness of my plan. It matched his own courtroom tactics perfectly. He put the phone down and folded his hands. He agreed to draft the airtight criminal complaints and prepare everything behind the scenes. He promised to coordinate directly with his contacts in federal law enforcement and the local police department. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously plotting a coordinated strike. Harrison would prepare the arrest warrants and hold them until my exact signal. We established a secure communication protocol for the day of the wedding. He would ensure that the financial institutions had all the necessary affidavits ready to restore my credit the instant the arrests were made, protecting my assets while allowing the trap to snap shut on my family. I authorized him to handle all legal maneuvering required to keep the investigation completely silent until the precise moment of execution. As I stood up to leave, Harrison shook my hand firmly. He told me he had represented cutthroat CEOs and ruthless hedge fund managers. But my particular brand of vengeance was something entirely unique. I thanked him, picked up my purse, and walked out of the glass tower. The legal weapon was now fully loaded and handed to an expert marksman. My family's prison sentences were secured in a locked briefcase in downtown Hartford. But the criminal complaints were only the first half of my strategy. Sending them to jail would satisfy the law, but to truly humiliate them in front of the Atlanta elite, I needed absolute power over the venue itself. I pulled out my phone and checked my corporate email, ready to execute the corporate acquisition that would make me the undisputed master of their wedding day. I stepped out of the elevator and into the polished marble lobby of my corporate headquarters. My hospitality investment group occupied the top floor of a prominent financial building in downtown Boston. While my family viewed my career as some basic mid-level accounting job, the reality was entirely different. I was a senior partner, managing a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Our firm specialized in acquiring luxury venues, restructuring their operations, and elevating their market value. For the past 8 months, my team had been quietly negotiating a massive merger and acquisition deal. The target of our aggressive takeover was Vanguard Hospitality Group. They were a premier catering and event management conglomerate. Their absolute crown jewel just happened to be the most sought-after wedding venue in the entire state of Connecticut, the Magnolia Estate. I walked into the main boardroom where my partners and the executive team from Vanguard were already seated. The atmosphere was thick with the adrenaline of a closing deal. Binders of complex legal documents covered the long glass table. I took my seat at the head of the table, projecting an aura of absolute calm and authority. We spent 2 rigorous hours reviewing the final addendums, ensuring every asset, liability, and subsidiary was properly accounted for. When the time came, the Vanguard executives signed the transfer agreements. I took my silver pen and signed my name on the final line. The ink dried on the contract, making the acquisition officially binding. In that singular moment, I became the silent majority owner of the Magnolia Estate. The poetic justice of the situation was almost overwhelming. Patricia and Jason had stolen my Social Security number to secure a fraudulent loan of $150,000. They wired that stolen money directly into the corporate accounts of Vanguard Hospitality to pay for a wedding that deliberately excluded me and humiliated my son. Now, by a twist of pure corporate fate, I owned the very accounts that held my stolen money. I possessed total authority over the property, the catering staff, the vendors, and the entire wedding execution. I was no longer just the victim of a federal crime. I was the landlord of their arrogant fantasy. I left the corporate office and drove straight to the Magnolia Estate. The property was breathtaking, featuring meticulously manicured gardens, classical architecture, and a sprawling lake that screamed generational wealth. I bypassed the main reception area and walked directly into the executive offices. I introduced myself to the general manager, a sharply groomed man named David. He had already received the urgent corporate memo regarding the acquisition and stood up immediately to greet his new boss. I closed his office door, locked the deadbolt, and sat across from his desk. I laid out my first executive order. I required his absolute, unwavering discretion. Under no circumstances was my identity as the new majority owner to be revealed to the staff, the vendors, or the clients. David agreed immediately, recognizing the serious, dangerous tone in my voice. I had him sign a strict non-disclosure agreement just to ensure airtight compliance. Once the legalities of our silence were firmly established, I asked David to pull up a specific client portfolio. I told him I needed to conduct a random quality assurance audit on an upcoming high-profile event. I gave him the name, the Jason and Naomi wedding. David clicked a few buttons on his computer terminal and printed out the master file. He handed me a thick, glossy binder detailing every single aspect of their extravagant day. I opened the folder and felt a cold smile form on my lips. The level of excessive spending was absolutely staggering. I flipped through the itemized receipts and vendor contracts. Jason and Naomi had spared no expense playing the role of wealthy aristocrats with total perfection. They ordered custom floral arches featuring rare imported orchids that cost more than a standard luxury vehicle. The dinner menu was incredibly lavish, including prime Wagyu beef and hand-shaved white truffles flown in directly from Italy. The bar tab was completely open and unlimited, stocked exclusively with vintage champagne that cost thousands of dollars per single bottle. They hired a 12-piece classical string quartet, a celebrity disc jockey, and a professional lighting crew to ensure Naomi's social media live streams would look flawlessly cinematic. Every single page of the massive binder dripped with extreme vanity and toxic ego. I traced my finger over the bottom line of the finalized invoice. The grand total was exactly $150,000. It was the exact amount stolen from my credit profile. My family was using my financial stability to buy rare truffles for people who looked down on me. They purchased vintage champagne to toast to their own fraudulent success, laughing at the struggling single mother they left in the dust. They were consuming my future to feed their pathetic illusion of grandeur. David watched me study the file, his professional demeanor slipping into slight confusion. He noticed my intense, calculating focus on the billing section. He cleared his throat and mentioned that the client had paid the massive balance in full via a direct wire transfer just 2 weeks prior. He asked if there was a problem with the funds or if he should flag the account for suspicious activity. I looked up at David, closing the heavy binder with a solid, echoing thud. I told him that the funds were entirely fraudulent and obtained through a massive felony identity theft. David's face completely drained of color. He panicked and immediately reached for his desk phone, asking if he should cancel the event, lock down the venue, and notify the local authorities. I placed my hand firmly on his desk, stopping him in his tracks. I told him to do no such thing. I instructed him to proceed with the event exactly as planned. I wanted him to serve the absolute best food, pour the most expensive champagne, and treat the bride and groom like absolute royalty. I wanted the illusion to be completely flawless. But I gave him one final, highly specific instruction. I told David to prepare a specialized final invoice printed on thick paper in striking red ink, and to keep it waiting on a silver platter until I gave him the signal. The weekend before the wedding, I received a reluctant, passive-aggressive invitation to Naomi's bachelorette party. Patricia had clearly forced her to send it, likely wanting me there, solely to serve as a visual contrast to their opulent lifestyle. They needed a peasant in the room to make their fabricated royalty feel more authentic. I had absolutely zero desire to spend my Saturday evening surrounded by superficial vanity, but I needed on-the-ground intelligence. I needed audio proof that Naomi and Patricia were fully aware of the extravagant expenses. I dressed in a tailored conservative charcoal suit, activated a high-definition voice recording application on my phone, and drove to the penthouse suite of a luxury hotel downtown. When I stepped out of the private elevator, the sheer volume of the music and the overwhelming scent of expensive perfume hit me like a physical wall. The penthouse was overflowing with Naomi's circle of micro-influencer friends. They were all wearing matching silk robes holding crystal flutes of champagne and posing aggressively in front of blinding ring lights. I walked into the main living area, keeping my posture rigid and my expression completely unreadable. A tall woman with heavy makeup and a glittering sash whose name I later learned was Madison immediately snapped her fingers in my direction. She did not even bother to look at my face. She shoved an empty cocktail glass toward my chest and sharply ordered me to fetch her another vodka martini from the corner bar. She genuinely thought I was part of the hotel staff. I did not correct her. I simply took the empty glass, offered a tight, obedient nod, and walked toward the bar. Treating me like the hired help was exactly the kind of camouflage I needed. It made me invisible. People do not guard their deepest secrets around the catering staff. I poured the drink, blending seamlessly into the background, and slowly navigated my way closer to the velvet sectional sofa where the guest of honor was holding court. Naomi sat in the center wearing a diamond tiara, broadcasting live to her followers. Before I could even reach the edge of the seating area, my mother Patricia intercepted me. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of absolute disgust. She loudly announced to the room that Jason's unfortunate sister had finally decided to show up. Patricia reached out and pinched the lapel of my charcoal suit, laughing cruelly. She asked if I had come straight from a funeral, or if I simply lacked the basic funds to buy an appropriate party dress. She made sure her voice carried over the thumping music, loudly whispering to Naomi's friends that it was terribly difficult for single mothers to afford anything nice these days. She painted me as a desperate, struggling woman who should be grateful just to breathe the same air as them. I maintained a mask of pure ice. I did not defend my wardrobe or my bank account. I just stood there, letting the hidden recording application capture every single syllable of her toxic abuse. Patricia patted my cheek patronizingly, telling me to stand in the back so my depressing energy would not ruin the aesthetic of their photographs. I gladly stepped into the shadows behind the large leather chairs, positioning my phone microphone perfectly to capture the conversations happening on the main sofa. Naomi finished her live stream and turned her attention to her bridesmaids. She tossed her hair over her shoulder and began bragging with the kind of shameless arrogance that only comes from spending other people's money. Madison leaned in and asked how Jason managed to afford such an insanely lavish venue. Naomi laughed, a high, piercing sound that grated against my ears. She proudly proclaimed that Jason possessed limitless wealth. She told her friends that her future husband was a self-made titan who secured a $150,000 wedding budget without even blinking an eye. Hearing her say the exact stolen dollar amount out loud sent a rush of cold satisfaction through my veins. I had her on tape, but I needed more. I needed specific details to tie her completely to the fraudulent invoice. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, silently urging her to keep talking. Naomi, fueled by champagne and an insatiable need for validation, happily obliged. She loudly detailed every luxury item to her captive audience. She bragged about the rare white truffles imported directly from Italy, emphasizing how much they cost per ounce. She gushed over the massive, custom-built floral arches that would line the ceremony aisle, bragging that they were comprised entirely of rare orchids. She even boasted about the vintage champagne tower, naming the exact exclusive brand I had seen on David's invoice just a few days prior. Naomi sat on that velvet sofa and painted a picture of absolute extravagance, completely oblivious to the fact that she was listing the precise evidence of a federal crime. She told her friends that Jason loved her so much, he would spare absolutely no expense to treat her like a queen. Patricia chimed in from the adjoining chair, proudly declaring that her son always knew how to secure the very best things in life. My mother actually took credit for raising such a magnificent, wealthy provider. She sat there, drinking champagne, bought with my stolen social security number, bragging about the financial prowess of a man who was nothing but a desperate thief. I stood in the corner, clutching my phone, recording every single detail. They were handing me the final nails for their own coffins. Naomi was establishing clear, undeniable knowledge of the massive expenditures, proving she was entirely complicit in consuming the stolen funds. Patricia was establishing her pride in the fraudulent transaction. The audio file growing on my device was rapidly becoming a masterpiece of self-incrimination. They thought they were the elite, untouchable stars of the evening, mocking the quiet woman standing in the shadows. They had absolutely no idea that I was just letting them dig their own graves. The music in the penthouse pulsed against the glass windows, and my phone continued to capture every damning word. I remained completely still, blending into the dark corner, content to let the evening play out. But Naomi, emboldened by the alcohol and the chorus of validating laughter from her bridesmaids, needed a more active target for her vanity. She stood up from the velvet sofa, adjusting her diamond tiara, and grabbed a half-empty glass from the side table. It was not the vintage champagne she had been bragging about. It was a cheap, neon-colored vodka mixer that one of her friends had abandoned earlier in the night. Naomi swayed slightly on her designer heels, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto my charcoal suit. She whispered something to Madison, who giggled and quickly pulled out her phone, hitting the record button for social media. Naomi strutted across the expensive hardwood floor, cutting straight through the crowd of influencers. The room's attention naturally followed the bride-to-be. My mother, Patricia, leaned forward in her leather chair, a malicious smirk forming on her face. Patricia was eager to watch her golden boy's future wife publicly humiliate the family scapegoat. Naomi stopped mere inches from me. She looked me up and down, with exaggerated performative pity. She loudly announced that I looked far too tense for a high society celebration and clearly needed to loosen up. Before I could even blink, she dramatically tilted her wrist forward. The sticky bright pink liquid poured directly down the front of my tailored suit, soaking into the premium fabric and pooling on my expensive shoes. Several girls in the room gasped loudly, but their shock was quickly followed by a chorus of cruel, mocking laughter. Naomi brought her hand to her mouth in a theatrical gesture of fake shock. She offered a high-pitched, insincere apology, claiming her hand had just slipped because her engagement ring was simply too heavy. Then her smile turned razor-sharp. She leaned in close, ensuring her friend's camera caught every single syllable of her insult. She told me she would have offered me a glass of the vintage champagne, but she knew my poverty mindset would not even be able to process the taste of real luxury. She explicitly stated that wasting a $1,000 bottle of champagne on someone who shops at discount outlets would be a terrible crime against her standard of living. Patricia's sharp laughter echoed above the pulsing music, completely validating the cruel physical assault on her own daughter. They waited eagerly for the breakdown. They waited for my face to crumple, for tears to well up in my eyes, for me to turn and flee the penthouse in absolute shame. That was the reaction a broken victim would give. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out a stark white handkerchief, and methodically dabbed the neon liquid from my lapel. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands did not shake at all. I finished wiping the stain, folded the handkerchief perfectly, and placed it back into my pocket. I looked up and met Naomi's gaze. The mocking smile on her face slowly faltered under the dead, freezing emptiness of my stare. The surrounding room suddenly grew very quiet, the energy shifting instantly from cruel amusement to intense, suffocating discomfort. I stepped 1 inch closer to her, invading her personal space. My voice was low, incredibly calm, and completely devoid of any emotional intimidation. I told her to drink up. I told her to savor every single drop of that vintage champagne, because it was going to be the most expensive drink she would ever consume in her entire life. Naomi blinked, visibly unnerved by my complete lack of emotional reaction. I did not wait for her to formulate a snappy response. I did not even glance at my mother. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the exit with flawless, unhurried posture. The heavy oak door of the penthouse clicked shut behind me, instantly cutting off the thumping bass of the music and the stunned silence of the bridesmaids. I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway and pressed the button for the elevator. As soon as the steel doors closed and the elevator began its descent to the lobby, I pulled my phone from my pocket. I stopped the hidden audio recording application. The file was exactly 47 minutes long. It contained 47 minutes of undeniable high-definition audio evidence. I had Patricia proudly admitting her complicity in Jason's financial maneuvers. I had Naomi explicitly listing the exact luxury items purchased with the fraudulent funds, proving her deep awareness and enthusiastic consumption of the stolen money. I walked out of the luxury hotel and got into my car. I did not turn the key in the ignition. Instead, I connected my phone to my secure mobile hotspot. I opened the encrypted digital portal linked directly to Harrison's law firm. I selected the massive audio file, titled it with Naomi and Patricia's names, and initiated the secure upload. A green progress bar moved rapidly across my screen. 90%, 95%, 100%. The file was securely locked into Harrison's federal-grade servers, safe from any tampering or deletion. A moment later, a text message from Harrison illuminated my dashboard screen. It read, "Audio received. Intent and complicity are fully established. The snare is legally set." I smiled the pink sticky stain on my suit, suddenly feeling like a badge of absolute victory. The legal trap was now completely flawless. Naomi and Patricia had just provided the final undeniable pieces of evidence required for their own federal indictments, and they had done it entirely voluntarily while mocking me. I started my car engine and drove away into the quiet night, knowing the next time I saw them would be the morning of their catastrophic and highly public downfall. The morning of their catastrophic and highly public downfall dawned bright and perfectly clear. I drove through the wrought iron gates of the Magnolia estate with Leo strapped into the back seat of my car. As we rolled up the mile-long private driveway, the absolute absurdity of my family's stolen wealth was put on full display. The venue grounds were swarming with event staff, working frantically to bring Naomi's extravagant vision to life. A massive team of florists was busy installing the custom arches, composed entirely of imported white orchids. 2 different ice sculptures were being carefully unloaded from a refrigerated truck near the main entrance. Valet attendants were already rushing to park a steady stream of luxury vehicles arriving from Atlanta. The sheer scale of the excess was breathtaking. Every single petal, every crystal goblet, and every silk chair cover had been paid for with a felony committed against my name. I held Leo's hand tightly as we walked past a string quartet practicing on the manicured front lawn. He looked around with wide, innocent eyes, asking if we were at a real castle. I looked down at him and softly replied that we were just visiting a house of cards that was about to collapse. I guided Leo into the grand foyer, navigating through the chaos of high-end caterers and frantic wedding planners. My intention was to briefly drop off an obligatory envelope at the bridal suite before finding our assigned seats in the back. As I approached the heavy double doors of the master preparation suite, a harsh voice cut through the hallway. My mother, Patricia, stepped directly into my path, physically blocking the entrance. She was already dressed in her custom-tailored mother-of-the-groom gown, dripping in rented diamonds and radiating toxic anxiety. She held her hand out flat, pressing it against my chest to stop me from taking another step forward. She looked down at Leo, her face contorting with overt annoyance, before turning her sharp glare back to me. She loudly announced that I was absolutely forbidden from crossing the threshold into Naomi's preparation area. I kept my face blank and asked her to clarify her reasoning. Patricia scoffed, adjusting her diamond necklace with a dismissive flick of her wrist. She explicitly stated that the bridal suite was a place of high vibration and pristine luxury. According to my mother, a struggling woman carrying a heavy single mother's energy would severely disrupt the aesthetic and potentially curse Naomi's big day. She claimed Naomi was already stressed enough about marrying into a new family and did not need my depressing poverty-stricken aura ruining her pre-wedding social media posts. Patricia aggressively commanded me to take my son and go hide in the back corridors until the ceremony began, ensuring we stayed completely out of sight from the wealthy Atlanta relatives who were currently enjoying mimosas inside. Once again, they handed me exactly what I needed, while believing they were punishing me. A normal sister would have been devastated by the cruel rejection. I just felt a cold, brilliant wave of satisfaction. Being banned from the bridal suite and told to wander the back corridors was the greatest tactical advantage Patricia could have possibly given me. It provided me with total unmonitored freedom to roam my own property. I offered my mother a polite, chilling nod. I told her I would gladly stay out of her way and ensure my energy did not interfere with their perfect illusion. Patricia smirked, clearly thrilled that she had successfully asserted her dominance, and slipped back behind the heavy double doors. The moment the lock clicked shut, my demeanor shifted from compliant sibling to absolute corporate authority. I walked Leo away from the bridal wing and took him directly to the executive administrative offices, a secure zone completely off-limits to standard wedding guests. I opened the door to the general manager's suite. David stood up immediately, his face tense with the weight of the impending execution. I introduced Leo to David and instructed my son to sit comfortably on the plush leather sofa in the corner with his tablet. I assured Leo that he was in the safest room in the entire building. Once Leo had his headphones on, I turned my full attention to David. The time for observation was over. We were moving into the final phase of the operation. I asked David for a full status report on the security protocols. He confirmed that the venue's private security team had been fully briefed and strategically repositioned. 4 plainclothes guards were currently stationed at all primary exits of the grand ballroom. 2 additional guards were placed near the service corridors to prevent any unauthorized escape attempts once the confrontation began. I nodded in approval, checking my encrypted messages. Attorney Harrison had just confirmed that his team, along with local and federal law enforcement officers, were standing by in unmarked vehicles just outside the property limits, waiting for my exact signal to breach the venue. The perimeter was entirely locked down. Jason and Patricia were securely trapped inside a cage of their own making. Finally, I asked David for the ultimate weapon. He unlocked his desk drawer and carefully pulled out a heavy silver catering platter. Resting in the exact center of the polished metal was the specialized document I had ordered. It was the final itemized invoice for the entire wedding production. David had printed it on thick premium cardstock. Just as I had instructed, every single line item, the Wagyu beef, the vintage champagne, the imported orchids, and the massive unapproved loan balance was printed in stark, blinding red ink. The number $150,000 glowed aggressively at the bottom of the page. It was a flawless visual representation of their financial crime. I picked up the invoice, verifying that the banking routing numbers matching my stolen identity were clearly displayed in the billing section. It was perfect. I placed the document back onto the silver platter. I looked at David, my voice dropping to a freezing absolute zero. I instructed him to keep the platter secure and to wait for my exact cue during the dinner reception. I left the executive suite with a profound sense of clarity, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floors of the private corridor. The chaotic symphony of the wedding preparations echoed from the main halls, a blend of frantic event planners shouting instructions and floral designers rushing to finalize Naomi's extravagant aesthetic. I needed to retrieve Leo from David's office shortly, but first I intended to walk the perimeter of the grand ballroom to ensure the seating arrangements matched the venue map. As I rounded the corner near the mahogany staircase, a heavy hand clamped down firmly on my shoulder. I turned sharply to find my father Richard standing right behind me. At 65 years old, my father had perfected the art of the distinguished benevolent patriarch. He wore a custom tuxedo that projected quiet authority, his silver hair impeccably styled. But I knew the man beneath the expensive fabric. Richard was the ultimate enabler, the silent architect of our toxic family dynamic who always sacrificed my well-being to keep the peace with Patricia and elevate Jason. He quickly dropped his hand and offered a warm, practiced smile, gently guiding me away from the bustling main hall and into an empty, dimly lit service corridor. He looked around to ensure we were completely alone before adopting a tone of deep paternal concern. He sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead, as if the weight of the day was taking a massive toll on him. He started by apologizing for Patricia's behavior at the bridal suite earlier that morning. He spun a masterful web of excuses, claiming my mother was simply overwhelmed by the high society pressure from Naomi's wealthy Atlanta relatives. He placed a comforting hand on my arm, telling me how much he appreciated my maturity and my willingness to stay out of the way for the sake of family harmony. He painted a picture of us being on the same team, the two rational adults trying to navigate Patricia's dramatic outbursts. I kept my expression entirely neutral, allowing him to weave his fabricated narrative. I knew Richard never initiated a private conversation unless he needed something from me. Right on cue, his tone shifted from emotional conciliation to casual business. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a tightly folded piece of paper along with a silver fountain pen. He chuckled lightly, shaking his head as if dealing with a minor ridiculous annoyance. He explained that the management of the Magnolia estate was being incredibly bureaucratic about their insurance policies. According to my father, the venue required a standard family liability waiver from all immediate blood relatives of the groom before the ceremony could officially commence. He held the document out to me, framing it as a meaningless administrative hurdle that we just needed to get out of the way so we could all enjoy the beautiful evening. I took the folded paper from his hand. As a high-level financial advisor who spent over a decade dissecting complex corporate contracts and liability agreements, my eyes automatically scanned the header and the dense blocks of legal text. It took me less than 2 seconds to realize this was absolutely not a venue insurance waiver. The document was a post-origination guarantor ratification form. It was a highly specific, legally binding contract designed by banking institutions to retroactively authorize a line of credit. The text explicitly stated that the undersigned individual fully consented to the utilization of their Social Security number for the $150,000 loan dispersed to Jason. It contained a sweeping indemnification clause designed to completely absolve the primary borrower and any acting agents from all claims of fraud, identity theft, or financial misrepresentation. The chilling reality of the paper in my hands hit me with the force of a freight train. Up until this exact second, I believed Richard was merely a passive bystander. I thought Patricia and Jason had committed the federal wire fraud on their own, keeping my father in the dark to avoid his lectures on financial responsibility. I was entirely wrong. Richard knew everything. He was fully aware that his wife and son had stolen my identity to fund this lavish spectacle. Instead of stopping them, instead of protecting his daughter, he actively colluded with them to cover up the felony. He leveraged his role as the caring diplomatic father to trick me into signing away my legal rights and absorbing a massive life-ruining debt. He looked at me with his warm, paternal eyes, fully expecting me to blindly sign the paper like the obedient, people-pleasing scapegoat I used to be. A fresh wave of freezing, calculating rage washed through my veins. The urge to rip the document to shreds and scream the truth in his face was nearly overpowering. But doing so would trigger an immediate panic. Richard would alert Patricia and Jason. They would realize their fraud was discovered, and the trap I had so meticulously built with Attorney Harrison would be compromised. I needed to secure this document. It was the ultimate, irrefutable proof of Richard's active complicity in the federal crime. I looked up from the paper, letting my shoulders slump slightly, adopting the persona of an exhausted, compliant daughter who just wanted the day to be over. I offered an apologetic, self-deprecating laugh. I patted the sides of my dress and tapped the small decorative clutch hanging from my wrist. I looked at my father with wide, innocent eyes and told him I had left my reading glasses in the glove compartment of my car. I explained that the venue lighting was far too dim in this corridor, and the legal font was giving me a terrible headache. Before Richard could process the excuse or offer to read it aloud to me, I decisively folded the ratification form and slipped it deep into the zippered pocket of my designer purse. I smiled brightly and assured him that I would grab my glasses right after the ceremony concluded and sign the venue waiver for him before the dinner reception began. Panic flashed instantly across Richard's distinguished features. The mask of the benevolent patriarch slipped, revealing the terrified co-conspirator underneath. He reached his hand out, his fingers twitching as he desperately tried to think of a reason to demand the paper back immediately. He stammered, claiming the wedding coordinator needed all the signatures filed before the music started, insisting that I should just sign it quickly without worrying about the fine print. I took a deliberate step back, maintaining my cheerful, oblivious facade. I told him I never sign anything without my glasses, a strict rule from my boring corporate job. I gave his arm a reassuring squeeze, promising again that I would handle it the second the vows were exchanged. I turned my back on my father and walked down the corridor, feeling his panicked gaze burning into my spine. I now held the physical evidence that would send all 3 of my family members to federal prison, resting securely inside my purse. I retrieved Leo from the executive administrative suite, offering David a final confirming nod before leaving the secure zone. My son grabbed my hand, sensing the shift in my posture. We walked together out of the main building and toward the spectacular glass conservatory, where the wedding ceremony was scheduled to take place. The late afternoon sun filtered perfectly through the vaulted glass ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the seating arrangements. The venue staff had truly outdone themselves. The space was transformed into an indoor botanical garden, completely dominated by the massive custom-built floral arches Naomi had bragged about at the bachelorette party. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded down the aisles, filling the air with a heavy, sweet fragrance. It was a breathtaking display of botanical artistry, and every single petal had been purchased with my stolen identity. An usher dressed in a sharp tuxedo approached us holding a velvet-bound seating chart. He looked at my modest dress, then down at his list, his polite smile failing to mask his clear disdain. He pointed his white-gloved hand past the rows of plush cushioned seating toward the very back of the conservatory. Naomi's family from Atlanta occupied the VIP front rows. They were a sea of designer silk bespoke suits and flashing diamonds, murmuring in hushed approving tones about the sheer opulence of the event. My mother Patricia and my father Richard sat directly across from them in the designated parent seating. Richard looked incredibly stiff, his posture rigid as he occasionally glanced over his shoulder, desperately scanning the crowd for me and the document resting in my purse. The usher led Leo and me to the absolute furthest corner of the room. Our assigned seats were 2 flimsy wooden folding chairs entirely separate from the main guest sections. We were positioned right next to the swinging metal doors of the temporary catering kitchen. Every time the kitchen staff rushed through the doors to prepare the reception appetizers, the loud clattering of industrial pans and a sharp gust of cold air washed over us. It was a deliberate, calculated insult. They wanted me to feel the full weight of my supposed inferiority. They wanted the wealthy Atlanta guests to see the outcast sister hidden away in the shadows, with her fatherless child, completely excluded from the inner circle of luxury. I sat down on the hard wooden chair and pulled Leo close to my side, smiling inwardly. They had given me the absolute best vantage point in the entire room to watch their impending destruction. A hush fell over the magnificent conservatory as the 12-piece classical string quartet began to play a soaring, dramatic overture. The heavy oak doors at the back of the aisle swung open. Naomi made her grand entrance, stepping onto the pristine white runner. She wore a custom-designed gown covered in thousands of hand-sewn crystals that caught the golden sunlight and scattered tiny rainbows across the ceiling. She walked down the aisle with the slow, practiced gait of royalty, ensuring her hired videographers captured every flawless angle for her social media platforms. She looked like a wealthy queen ascending to her throne, blissfully ignorant that her entire kingdom was financed by a felony. Jason waited for her under the magnificent floral arch. He wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. As Naomi reached the altar, he took her hands, projecting the image of a powerful, capable provider. The officiant spoke a few introductory words about love and commitment before stepping back to allow the couple to exchange their personal vows. Jason was handed a silver microphone. His voice echoed through the high-end sound system, filling every corner of the glass conservatory. He did not speak about love, partnership, or mutual respect. Jason delivered a speech entirely focused on his own ego and his fabricated financial superiority. He looked out at Naomi's wealthy family and shamelessly bragged about his relentless dedication to success. He talked about his grueling professional grind, his unyielding ambition, and his ability to overcome massive obstacles through sheer self-made willpower. He spun a disgusting narrative of a man who had built his own empire from the ground up. He squeezed Naomi's hands and confidently promised to provide her with a kingdom of limitless luxury. He swore to give her the world, claiming that his massive financial success was solely dedicated to ensuring she never had to want for anything. I sat in the cold draft of the catering doors listening to the most outrageous hypocrisy I had ever witnessed. He was bragging about his financial prowess while actively defaulting on the stolen loan that paid for the microphone in his hand. He was promising her a kingdom while standing on property that I completely owned. The sheer audacity of his performance was sickening, yet deeply validating. The trap I had set was fully justified. Leo shifted uncomfortably on his hard wooden chair. He had been incredibly patient watching the lavish ceremony unfold from our isolated corner. He leaned his head against my arm, his small fingers gripping my hand tightly. He looked up at the altar, watching his uncle project total confidence to the crowd. But Leo noticed something the Atlanta elite did not. He noticed the subtle nervous movements of Jason's eyes. Every time Jason swept his gaze across the room to emphasize a point about family or loyalty, his eyes deliberately skipped over our dark corner. He refused to look in our direction. Leo tugged on my sleeve, his voice a soft, innocent whisper, barely audible over the echoing sound of the microphone. "Mom," he asked, looking genuinely confused by the dynamic, "why does Uncle Jason keep looking away from us? Why will he not look at our table?" Before the waiter could clear my dinner plate, a suffocating cloud of heavy designer perfume washed over table 14. Brittany marched across the ballroom floor, dragging her massive $20,000 silk gown behind her. She had abandoned the head table specifically to hunt me down in my designated corner of exile. Her face was flushed with expensive wine and the intoxicating thrill of being the absolute center of attention. She stopped right behind my chair, crossing her arms and looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had come to deliver what she believed was the final crushing blow to my self-esteem. Leo did not fully understand the heavy, literal truth behind my words, but he recognized the serious, unyielding tone of my voice. He nodded slowly, leaning back against my shoulder as we turned our attention back to the altar. Jason finished his fraudulent vows to a round of enthusiastic applause from the VIP seating. They sealed their union with a kiss, legally binding Naomi to a man who was about to face a decade in federal prison. The string quartet played a triumphant recessional march. The ceremony concluded, and the guests began to transition toward the grand ballroom for the evening reception. The time for silent observation was officially over. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my dress, ready to execute the final devastating phase of my plan. "You spent your entire life thinking you were so much better than me just because you started some boring real estate company," she sneered, her eyes flashing with venomous victory. "You worked 80-hour weeks. You isolated yourself. You bought expensive suits. And for what? Look at you now. You are 33, totally alone, sitting in the back corner of a room while I just married a technology mogul. I secured generational wealth without ever having to lift a finger. I won at life, Stella. I completely beat you." Her absolute delusion was truly a marvel to witness. She stood there bragging about conquering the world, completely oblivious to the fact that her new husband was actively drowning in $4 million of aggressive debt and facing decades in federal prison. I let her continue her pathetic monologue, giving her the space to dig her own grave as deeply as possible. "You have always cared about nothing but money," Brittany added, her tone shifting from a gloat to a direct order. "You hoard your wealth while our parents struggle. So since you clearly have no one else to spend your millions on, DeAndre, and I have decided on the perfect wedding gift from you. We are booking a month-long luxury honeymoon at a private overwater villa in the Maldives. The total cost is roughly $150,000, including the first-class flights. We expect you to wire the full amount to DeAndre's primary holding account by Monday morning. Consider it your way of apologizing for your terrible attitude and finally contributing something useful to this family. If you do not pay for the trip, Mom and Dad agreed they will publicly freeze you out of the family trust entirely. I looked up at her flushed, greedy face, the sheer audacity of her extortion attempt hanging heavily in the air. I reached for my crystal water goblet, took a very slow, refreshing sip, and set it down precisely on the linen coaster. "I am going to have to politely decline that generous offer, Brittany," I replied, my voice dangerously calm and echoing with corporate authority. "I have a very strict personal financial policy. I absolutely do not finance tropical luxury vacations for men who are currently under active federal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission." Richard stood a few feet away, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, nodding in solemn agreement as other guests praised his son's financial prowess. He played the role of the humble, highly successful patriarch to absolute perfection. Not a single trace of the terrified, sweating man from the service corridor remained on his face. He completely believed that by forcing me to take that liability waiver, he had successfully covered their tracks and shielded himself from federal prison. He actually believed he had won the long game. My parents paraded around the grand ballroom, soaking up the admiration and the elevated social status they had stolen my identity to purchase. They were riding the absolute highest peak of their narcissistic delusions. I sat in the very back of the room, completely isolated from the glittering celebration. My assigned table was exceptionally small, shoved into the dark, drafty corner, right next to the kitchen swinging doors. The other chairs at my table remained entirely empty, a deliberate choice by Patricia and Jason to ensure Leo and I were cut off from the rest of the guest list. Leo sat quietly beside me, happily distracted by a colorful racing game on his digital tablet. He was completely oblivious to the massive social dynamics and the impending criminal consequences playing out across the ballroom floor. He did not care about the imported flowers or the crystal chandeliers overhead. He was just a sweet, innocent boy, waiting patiently for his dinner. I watched the spectacle unfold with cold, detached precision. I studied the layout of the room, identifying the primary exits, the service corridors, and the optimal entry points for law enforcement. The grand ballroom featured 3 main double doors leading to the grand lobby, 2 emergency exits near the outdoor terrace, and the catering doors right next to my table. The trap was perfectly enclosed and structurally flawless. I reached into my designer purse, my fingers brushing against the folded liability waiver Richard had tried to force on me earlier. I pulled out my secure mobile device and opened the encrypted messaging application linked directly to Attorney Harrison. My hands did not shake at all. My heart rate remained incredibly steady, beating with the calm rhythm of absolute certainty. I typed a single decisive message: "Deploy security to all exits. Bring the police." I hit send. The delivery confirmation icon lit up the screen immediately. Less than 10 seconds later, Harrison replied with a simple, chilling confirmation: "Operations authorized. Teams are moving into position." I placed my phone face down on the table, locking my screen. The invisible snare was now fully activated. Outside the heavy stone walls of the Magnolia Estate, federal officers and local police were quietly stepping out of their unmarked vehicles into the cool evening air. They were actively coordinating with the venue's private security team, securing the perimeter and ensuring absolutely no one could leave the property without passing through a heavily armed checkpoint. Inside the ballroom, the oblivious guests continued to laugh, drink, and loudly celebrate a federal felony. The tension in the air began to thicken, pulling tight like a coiled steel spring right before it violently snaps. The string quartet transitioned from classical background music to a lively, upbeat tempo, signaling the formal beginning of the highly anticipated dinner service. The head caterer stepped out from the kitchen doors right next to my table, adjusting his earpiece and giving a sharp, authoritative nod to his waiting staff. A massive line of servers emerged from the kitchen, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with the first course. The clinking of fine crystal glasses and the loud, boastful laughter of Naomi's relatives echoed sharply off the vaulted ceilings. The extravagant $67 Wagyu steaks were being plated in the kitchen, the rich, intoxicating aroma of seared meat and truffle butter wafting heavily into the dining room. Everything was moving exactly according to the strict, luxurious schedule Jason and Naomi had demanded from their wedding planners. The climax of their stolen fantasy was rapidly approaching, setting the absolute perfect stage for their total and uncompromising destruction. The heavy metal doors of the catering kitchen swung open with rhythmic, practiced precision. A perfectly synchronized line of waitstaff emerged into the grand ballroom, carrying massive silver trays balanced expertly on their shoulders. The rich, savory aroma of seared Wagyu beef and truffle butter immediately overpowered the sweet scent of the imported floral arrangements. The servers moved like a highly trained military unit, fanning out across the polished marble floor to deliver the incredibly expensive first course to the waiting guests. Naturally, they prioritized the head table and the VIP seating occupied by Naomi's elite Atlanta relatives. I watched as the silver cloches were lifted in absolute unison, revealing perfectly cooked $67 steaks, resting on beds of artisanal root vegetable puree. The wealthy guests murmured their loud performative approval, clinking their crystal glasses to toast Jason's apparent generosity and boundless financial success. In our drafty, isolated corner at the very back of the room, my 7-year-old son Leo perked up. The smell of the hot food reached our table, and he quietly set his digital tablet aside. He had been so incredibly patient all day, navigating the cold dismissals of his grandparents and the chaotic energy of the venue without a single complaint. His stomach gave a soft, audible rumble. He looked up at me with wide, hopeful eyes, watching a young waiter break away from the main formation and walk directly toward our lonely table. The waiter carried a smaller tray, balancing 2 elegant porcelain plates, each holding the signature Wagyu steak dish. He offered a polite professional smile as he approached, preparing to serve us the exact same meal that the rest of the high society guests were currently enjoying. Before the young server could even lower the tray, heavy aggressive footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Jason marched across the ballroom, cutting straight through the tables with his velvet tuxedo jacket flapping open. He did not look like a joyous groom checking on his guests. He looked like an arrogant dictator determined to assert his absolute dominance over the lowest-ranking person in the room. He held something completely out of place in his right hand. It was a cheap, flimsy white paper plate. He intercepted the waiter just inches from our table, throwing his arm out to physically block the young man from serving the food. Jason barked a harsh order, commanding the waiter to take one of those plates back to the kitchen immediately. The sudden, aggressive volume of his voice caused several guests at the nearby tables to stop eating and turn their heads in our direction. Jason turned his attention completely to me, a cruel, malicious smirk stretching across his face. He extended his arm and carelessly dropped the flimsy paper plate directly onto the silk tablecloth in front of Leo. On the plate lay a single cold, wrinkled hot dog inside a remarkably stale bun. There was no ketchup, no mustard, and no side dish. It looked like a discarded piece of garbage swept off the floor of a discount sports arena. "We did not order for your son," Jason announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the ambient noise of the ballroom. He made absolutely sure the wealthy Atlanta guests sitting nearby could hear every single syllable of his humiliation. The catering budget was incredibly tight, and kids his age do not appreciate fine dining anyway. "Eat up, buddy." He offered a deeply condescending pat on Leo's head, treating my son like an unwanted stray animal that he was generously feeding out of pure charity. Leo shrank back into his wooden folding chair, looking down at the pathetic meal with utter confusion. Just one table over, Naomi's nieces and nephews, who were the exact same age as Leo, were eagerly cutting into their prime Wagyu beef and laughing loudly. The contrast was viciously deliberate. Jason wanted the entire room to witness his power over us. He wanted to clearly establish that my son and I were second-class citizens, barely tolerated dependents who were wholly unworthy of the luxury he had provided for his bride's family. Naomi, sitting at the head table, paused her live stream just long enough to shoot me a sickly sweet, incredibly pitying smile before turning back to her adoring audience. As if the scene required even more toxicity, my mother, Patricia, materialized right beside Jason. She had marched over from the VIP section, eager to join the public execution of my dignity. She looked down her nose at me, her 62-year-old face pulled into a tight, dramatic frown of absolute disapproval. "You really should have packed him something, Clara," she stated, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "You know perfectly well how hard Jason and Naomi work to afford all of this luxury. Being a single mother means you need to plan ahead and take basic responsibility. You cannot just expect a free ride at an exclusive event like this." She crossed her arms, portraying herself as the wise, long-suffering matriarch dealing with a hopelessly incompetent daughter. The surrounding high society guests from Atlanta openly stared at me in harsh, unrelenting judgment. I could hear their hushed whispers criticizing my apparent lack of maternal preparation and praising Jason and Patricia for tolerating such an embarrassing relative. They looked at me with pure disdain, entirely convinced by the narrative my family had expertly spun. In the past, under the crushing weight of that unified public shaming, I would have broken. I would have grabbed Leo, gathered my things, and run to the parking lot in tears, completely defeated by their cruelty. But the woman sitting in that chair was no longer their victim. I was a senior financial executive holding the detonator to a massive federal explosive. I looked at the sad, wrinkled hot dog resting on the cheap paper plate. Then I slowly raised my eyes to meet my brother's arrogant, mocking gaze. I looked past him to my mother, observing the toxic pride radiating from her posture. I reached out, placed my hand on the edge of the paper plate, and calmly pushed it away from my son. I did not raise my voice, and my expression remained a mask of pure, freezing ice. "Noted," I said. That single emotionless word hung in the air between us. It was not a surrender. It was the absolute definitive point of no return. The final piece of the puzzle had firmly clicked into place. Jason smirked, believing he had thoroughly won the interaction, and turned his back on me to return to his stolen throne. He walked away completely blind to the fact that I had just given the silent, catastrophic signal for his total destruction. Jason was halfway across the polished marble floor, his velvet tuxedo jacket swaying with each arrogant stride. He was heading straight for the head table, ready to reclaim his seat beside Naomi and bask in the glow of the Atlanta elite's approval. I did not watch my brother. I shifted my gaze toward the heavy, swinging doors of the catering kitchen. David, the general manager of the Magnolia Estate, stood perfectly still in the shadows of the service corridor. Our eyes met across the vast expanse of the ballroom. I offered a single sharp nod. The execution phase had officially commenced. David stepped out of the shadows. He was dressed in a flawless charcoal gray three-piece suit, projecting an aura of absolute authority that instantly distinguished him from the standard waitstaff. In his white-gloved hands, he carried a heavy, polished silver platter. He moved with the precision of a heat-seeking missile, his posture impossibly straight, his footsteps echoing faintly beneath the lively melodies of the string quartet. To reach my isolated table in the back corner, David had to navigate the entire length of the grand ballroom. He walked directly past the VIP sections. He walked right past the imported floral arches and the massive 6-tier wedding cake. Most importantly, he walked right past the head table where Naomi was still holding her smartphone high, live-streaming her luxurious evening to her eager online audience. Normally, the general manager of an ultra-luxury venue would prioritize the bride and groom. He would check on their comfort, ensure their glasses were full, and cater to their every whim. Instead, David completely ignored Jason and Naomi. He did not even glance in their direction. Several wealthy guests from Atlanta noticed this bizarre breach of high society etiquette. They paused with their crystal champagne flutes halfway to their lips, their brows furrowing in confusion as they watched the highest-ranking staff member deliberately bypass the people who supposedly paid for the entire spectacular event. Jason, noticing the sudden shift in the guests' attention, stopped walking. He turned around, expecting David to approach him with compliments or VIP service. A smug, expectant smile formed on his lips. He even puffed out his chest, ready to play the generous host receiving praise from the venue management. But David did not stop. He walked right past my brother, leaving Jason standing awkwardly in the middle of the dance floor like a forgotten prop. David marched straight into the cold, drafty corner of the room and stopped directly in front of my flimsy wooden folding chair. He clicked his heels together slightly and executed a deep, respectful bow. It was not the standard polite nod given to a regular guest. It was a profound display of absolute corporate deference, the kind of bow reserved strictly for the highest level of ownership. The string quartet was transitioning between songs, creating a brief, natural lull in the ambient noise of the room. David capitalized on this exact moment of quiet. He straightened his posture, holding the silver platter out toward me. Resting in the center of the gleaming metal was the thick premium cardstock document I had ordered. Its text was printed in blinding, undeniable red ink, a glaring contrast to the soft silver and white aesthetic of the wedding. As requested, Madam Chairman, David announced. His voice was incredibly crisp, booming with a trained theatrical resonance that carried effortlessly across the marble floors and bounced off the vaulted glass ceilings. The final invoice. Those 7 words hit the grand ballroom like a physical shockwave. The title, Madam Chairman, echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence. Jason's arrogant, mocking smirk evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated confusion. His jaw literally dropped. His eyes darted frantically between me, David, and the silver platter. He could not comprehend why the manager of the most exclusive property in the state was bowing to his scapegoat sister. Jason took a hesitant, shaking step backward, bumping directly into an empty chair. The color drained from his knuckles as he gripped the edge of a table for support. His mind was racing desperately, trying to construct a lie that could possibly explain away the impossible scene unfolding right in front of his eyes. Patricia, who had just returned to her seat in the parent section, froze with a piece of Wagyu beef hovering near her mouth. The color drained completely from her 62-year-old face, leaving her looking pale, terrified, and suddenly very small. At the head table, Naomi's perfectly curated influencer persona completely glitched. She slowly lowered her smartphone, abandoning her live stream mid-sentence. Her thousands of viewers were suddenly treated to a blurry view of the floor as she stared at the back corner of the room, completely incapable of processing what was happening. The woman she had intentionally spilled a sticky drink on, the single mother she had mocked for having a poverty mindset, was just addressed as the ultimate authority of the very venue she was currently bragging about. She looked down at her lavish, custom-beaded wedding gown, completely unaware that the expensive fabric clinging to her body was technically state evidence of a massive financial crime. The surrounding high society relatives from Atlanta stopped eating entirely. The clinking of silverware against porcelain ceased completely. The loud, boastful laughter died in their throats. They looked at the sad, wrinkled hot dog sitting on the paper plate in front of Leo. Then they looked at the impeccably dressed general manager, bowing deeply to the woman they had just spent the last 10 minutes harshly judging. The stark, undeniable visual contrast created a heavy, suffocating tension. The entire social hierarchy of the room had just flipped completely upside down in a matter of seconds. Leo looked up at me, his small hand still holding mine, his eyes wide with innocent wonder at the sudden change in the atmosphere. I squeezed his hand reassuringly, letting him know that everything was perfectly under control. I calmly reached out and picked up the heavy document from the silver platter. I did not rush. I let the heavy silence stretch, allowing the absolute terror to begin sinking deeply into my family's minds. I looked down at the bright red ink verifying the massive $150,000 total and the fraudulent banking routing numbers printed clearly at the bottom. The weapon was finally drawn. The trap had officially snapped shut. The air in the grand ballroom grew incredibly thick, suffocating the joyous celebration that had been thriving just moments before. I took a slow, deliberate breath, fully prepared to tear down the entire fake empire they had built on my stolen identity. I slowly stood up from the flimsy wooden folding chair. I placed my hand gently on Leo's shoulder, instructing him to keep his noise-canceling headphones on and continue playing his game. He gave me a small nod, completely insulated from the impending chaos. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, squared my shoulders, and began my walk toward the center of the grand ballroom. The master of ceremonies, a hired professional meant to keep the evening flowing smoothly, stood near the edge of the polished dance floor. He held a sleek wireless microphone, preparing to announce the traditional family toasts. He watched my approach, his practiced smile faltering. He tried to quickly determine why a marginalized guest from the absolute worst table in the room was aggressively marching into his designated workspace. I did not ask for his permission. I reached out and took the microphone directly from his hands. He gasped, stepping back in pure shock, but a sharp, authoritative glare from David, who remained standing at attention near my table, froze the man in his tracks. The master of ceremonies wisely retreated into the shadows. I gripped the cool metal of the microphone and flicked the power switch. I tapped the top of the device twice. The sharp, heavy thumps echoed violently through the venue's premium sound system, instantly slicing through the ambient chatter and the soft melodies of the string quartet. The musicians abruptly stopped playing. Complete, suffocating silence slammed into the grand ballroom. 200 high society guests turned their heads, simultaneously staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep offense. I stood perfectly still in the dead center of the floor, holding the red ink invoice in my left hand and the microphone in my right. I raised the microphone to my lips. "Good evening, everyone," I said. My voice projected with absolute unwavering clarity. It lacked any hint of anger, sadness, or typical familial drama. It was the exact tone I used when dismantling hostile corporate takeovers in downtown boardrooms. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Clara. I am Jason's younger sister. I am the single mother who was just publicly humiliated and deemed unworthy of consuming the same meal as the rest of you. Murmurs of extreme discomfort rippled through the VIP seating area. Naomi's wealthy parents shifted uneasily in their seats, clearly irritated by this unscripted interruption. Patricia looked like she was about to faint, her manicured hands gripping the edge of her table so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. "But I am not standing here tonight merely as the family scapegoat," I continued, my voice cutting cleanly through their judgmental whispers. "I am standing here in my official professional capacity. I am a senior partner at the Hospitality Investment Group that successfully closed a major corporate acquisition less than 48 hours ago. Our newest subsidiary happens to be Vanguard Hospitality, the parent company of the Magnolia Estate." The murmurs instantly ceased. The air in the ballroom grew incredibly thin. Naomi's father, a powerful businessman from Atlanta, narrowed his eyes, suddenly recognizing the corporate terminology and the absolute gravity of my posture. "Therefore," I announced, letting my gaze sweep slowly across the terrified faces of my immediate family. "I do not just belong in this room. I own it. I own the massive vaulted glass roof over your heads. I own the expensive silver chairs you are currently sitting on right now. I own the crystal chandeliers illuminating your expensive jewelry, and I own every single ounce of the imported food you are eating tonight." The initial wave of upper-class confusion rippling through Naomi's family instantly evaporated. It was violently replaced by a stunned, paralyzed silence. They were highly educated, wealthy individuals who understood power dynamics perfectly. They realized immediately that the woman they had spent the entire evening judging and pitying was actually the apex predator of the room. The sheer scale of my absolute corporate authority crashed down on them firmly, locking them directly into their seats. Naomi sat frozen at the head table, her mouth slightly open, the heavy diamond tiara on her head suddenly looking like a cheap costume prop. Her expensive mobile phone, still resting quietly on its electronic gimbal, remained completely ignored by everyone. The reality of my statement was short-circuiting her brain. She looked at Jason, desperately waiting for him to shut me down, to take control, and to prove that he was the limitless provider he claimed to be. Jason finally broke the suffocating silence. He forced a loud, incredibly unnatural laugh that echoed awkwardly across the marble floor. "Clara! Come on!" he shouted, his voice cracking violently with rising, undeniable panic. "You always do this. You always try to make my achievements about you. This is just a sick joke." He stood up from the head table, attempting to project his usual arrogant dominance, but his legs were visibly shaking. He waved his hand toward the Atlanta elite, trying to enlist them in his desperate narrative. "Do not listen to her," he pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead. "She is just an unstable, jealous accountant, trying to ruin my big night because she cannot afford a life like this. It is a pathetic prank." He laughed again, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that convinced absolutely no one. His wealthy in-laws did not join in. They stared at him with cold, calculating scrutiny, recognizing the distinct smell of a cornered fraudster. I did not raise my voice to shout over his frantic babbling. I lifted the silver invoice, the premium cardstock, glaring brilliantly with bright red ink, and held it extremely high for the entire room to clearly see. "This is not a joke, Jason," I said, my voice echoing throughout the room with swift, lethal finality. "I am not here to ruin your big night or damage your reputation. I am here to collect my stolen money today." I kept the microphone raised, my eyes locked securely on Jason's trembling frame. Without breaking eye contact, I raised my left hand and gave a sharp, precise gesture toward the elevated audio-visual booth situated at the very back of the grand ballroom. The venue technicians, fully briefed by David earlier this afternoon and operating under my direct corporate authority, executed the command instantly. The ambient crystal lighting dimmed to a dramatic cinematic dark. The heavy mechanical whir of motorized screens descending from the vaulted ceiling echoed clearly across the suddenly silent room. These were the massive high-definition projectors originally intended to display a romantic, heavily edited slideshow of Jason and Naomi's fabricated love story. Instead, the brilliant white light of the projectors pierced the darkness, illuminating the walls with staggering, undeniable clarity. A collective gasp rose from the Atlanta elite as the first slide populated on the giant screens. It was not a flattering picture of the happy couple. It was a high-resolution, unredacted scan of a federal banking document. The screens displayed the official personal loan origination file, blown up to 20 feet tall, for every single guest to read. I paced slowly across the polished marble floor, my voice projecting through the state-of-the-art speakers with absolute chilling authority. "Let us direct our attention to the screens," I announced, gesturing to the undeniable digital evidence looming over their heads. "What you are looking at is a formally approved high-yield personal loan application. The principal amount requested and disbursed is exactly $150,000. The primary borrower listed on the first page is my brother Jason." I paused for a brief second, allowing the enormous dollar amount to fully sink into the minds of Naomi's wealthy relatives. I clicked a small presentation remote, hidden securely in my palm, advancing the system to the next slide. The screen shifted to display a heavily magnified section of the guarantor signature page, complete with verified digital IP logs and rigid timestamp data. As many of you in the financial and business sectors know, I continued a man with Jason's completely ruined credit history, could never secure a six-figure loan without a pristine, highly qualified guarantor to back him up. I advanced the slide, once again revealing the exact social security number and banking details used to secure the fraudulent funds, with only my personal digits partially redacted for basic security purposes. 3 weeks ago, while I was sound asleep in my apartment, my mother Patricia accessed a digital lending portal, utilizing the registered Wi-Fi network at her house in Connecticut. She bypassed the standard security protocols and actively inputted my social security number into the guarantor section. She deliberately forged my electronic signature and submitted fraudulent employment verification documents utilizing my stolen pay stubs. She illegally bound me to a massive, life-altering debt simply to bypass the bank's strict underwriting algorithms. Patricia committed aggravated familial identity theft to ensure her son could maintain his pathetic, hollow illusion of generational wealth. A low, horrified murmur swept rapidly through the front rows. Naomi's father adjusted his expensive silk tie, his distinguished face turning a deep, angry shade of crimson as he finally realized his new son-in-law was completely bankrupt and actively committing fraud. I clicked the remote one more time. The massive screen shifted away from the banking documents to display the itemized corporate invoice from Vanguard Hospitality, perfectly mirroring the thick red paper I currently held in my hand. Let us break down exactly how my stolen future was aggressively consumed tonight, I said, my voice echoing like a federal judge reading a final sentencing mandate. I pointed directly at Naomi, who remained completely frozen in her chair at the head table. That custom-beaded designer wedding dress clinging to you right now was purchased with $12,000 of my stolen credit. I swept my free arm toward the massive, fragrant displays surrounding the pristine dance floor. The imported white orchid floral arches that you all took elegant photographs in front of cost $15,000, paid for entirely by felony wire fraud. I looked down at the plates resting on the silver silk tablecloths. Even the $67 prime Wagyu steaks you are currently eating were funded by the exact same criminal enterprise. Every single ounce of luxury in this magnificent room was paid for by a severe federal crime committed against my name. I walked closer to the VIP section, staring directly into the terrified, panicked eyes of my mother and brother. They wanted you to believe they were elite titans of industry, I projected over the microphone, ensuring my voice reached the absolute back of the hall. They wanted to impress Atlanta high society so desperately that they consciously decided to rob their own flesh and blood. They sat at my dining table, aggressively demanded I give them my hard-earned savings, and when I flatly refused, they stole my identity behind my back. They willingly risked my ability to provide for my 7-year-old son. They consciously risked my professional corporate licenses and my long-term financial freedom, all to buy vintage champagne for people who actively despise me. I lowered the microphone slightly, letting the raw, heavy truth of the situation crush the remaining breathable air out of the grand ballroom. You are not attending the prestigious social event of the season, I declared, sealing their absolute, inescapable ruin. You are currently sitting in the exact middle of an active federal crime scene, and the lavish kingdom you are celebrating was built entirely on a felony committed against a single mother. The profound shock rippling through the wealthy guests was absolute and devastating. They stared at the screens, thoroughly outraged by the undeniable proof displaying above them. Patricia tried to stand up, her knees trembling so violently that she collapsed right back into her chair, covering her face in complete shame. Jason remained entirely speechless, his fabricated fake empire dissolving instantly under the crushing weight of the projected banking records. The silence in the grand ballroom shattered into a wave of profound, suffocating horror. Naomi's wealthy relatives from Atlanta, individuals who built their entire identities on pristine reputations and unblemished social standing, stared at the massive projection screens in absolute disbelief. These were prominent figures in their community, corporate executives, politicians, and influential socialites who guarded their public image with ruthless precision. To be directly associated with a cheap, desperate felony was the ultimate social poison. Disgust rippled visibly through the VIP section. The admiration they held for Jason just moments ago completely morphed into visceral contempt. They realized they had been duped by a family of common thieves playing dress-up. The whispering started immediately, a low, buzzing hive of harsh judgment that echoed off the crystal chandeliers overhead. They looked at the imported floral centerpieces and the untouched Wagyu beef, not with awe, but with intense revulsion. They realized every bite they took, every glass of vintage champagne they sipped, implicated them in a massive financial crime against a single mother. Naomi's mother stood up from her seat at the head table. She was an intimidating, deeply respected woman in the Atlanta social scene, accustomed to commanding deference wherever she went. The heavy diamond collar around her neck glittered sharply under the venue lights as she turned her piercing, furious gaze directly onto Patricia. She did not yell, but her voice carried a lethal, icy authority that cut through the murmurs of the crowd with absolute precision. She demanded a full explanation immediately. She asked Patricia to look her in the eye and justify how she dared to drag their highly respected family name into a filthy, desperate scam. She demanded to know why they had humiliated her daughter by dressing her in stolen goods and throwing a reception funded by felony identity theft. Patricia physically shrank under the intense, unrelenting scrutiny. The arrogant, condescending matriarch, who had spent the entire evening bragging about her son's fabricated wealth, was completely paralyzed. All the color rapidly drained from Patricia's 62-year-old face, leaving her looking sickly hollow and utterly pathetic. Her mouth opened, but only stuttering, breathless gasps escaped. She tried to reach her trembling hands out toward Naomi's mother in a desperate plea for understanding, attempting to craft a lie about a terrible administrative misunderstanding. Naomi's mother instantly took a sharp step back, swatting the air with her hand in a gesture of absolute repulsion, refusing to let Patricia's tainted fingers come anywhere near her custom designer gown. At the center of the head table, Naomi was undergoing a complete psychological collapse. She gripped the edge of the silver silk tablecloth, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric as she began hyperventilating. Her chest heaved with short, panicked gasps. The harsh reality of the situation crashed down on her carefully curated world. She was a lifestyle influencer whose entire brand was built on projecting flawless luxury, unbothered wealth, and superior aesthetics. She suddenly realized that the thousands of loyal followers she had been bragging to all night were currently watching her public execution. Her smartphone, still mounted on its electronic gimbal, was actively broadcasting the giant projected bank statements to her entire digital audience. Her comments section, previously filled with heart emojis and endless congratulations, was undoubtedly exploding with realization and brutal mockery. Her entire online brand, her sponsorships, and her curated lifestyle were now permanently tethered to a grand-scale federal crime. The custom-beaded gown she wore suddenly felt like a heavy, suffocating prison uniform. She grabbed her head, sobbing uncontrollably, realizing that she would not be remembered as a glamorous, wealthy bride, but as the unwitting accomplice to a pathetic fraudster. Her lungs struggled for air as the devastating weight of her ruined reputation pressed down on her shoulders. Jason watched his wealthy in-laws recoil in disgust and heard his bride sobbing in pure panic. The golden boy illusion he had spent his entire life building completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. He had no lies left to spin, no money left to hide behind, and no mother capable of rescuing him from the consequences of his actions. His humiliation quickly mutated into explosive, uncontrolled rage. He locked his furious eyes on me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He screamed that I was completely ruining his life, completely ignoring the absolute fact that he was the one who stole my identity and financed his lies with my future. He kicked his silver chair backwards, sending it crashing violently against the polished marble floor. He lunged aggressively across the room, charging directly toward me like a cornered, desperate animal. His hands reached out, his fingers clawing at the air, desperate to snatch the wireless microphone from my grip. He wanted to silence the truth. He wanted to physically stop his public destruction and force everyone to stop looking at the massive projection screens exposing his federal crimes. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground, perfectly holding the microphone at my side, fully aware of the tactical preparations I had made earlier with David. Before Jason could even cross the midpoint of the dance floor, the venue security team engaged. 4 highly trained plainclothes security guards materialized from the shadows of the service corridors with terrifying speed. They moved with absolute calculated precision, intercepting my brother mid-stride. The lead guard grabbed Jason by the shoulders, using his own aggressive momentum against him, and drove him forcefully downward. They tackled Jason hard, pinning him flat against the cold, polished marble floor of the grand ballroom. His expensive velvet tuxedo jacket ripped loudly at the shoulder seam as they restrained his arms securely behind his back. Jason thrashed wildly against the marble, screaming insults and demanding they let him go. He shouted that he paid for this venue and they worked for him. He was completely unaware that the guards were acting under the direct, explicit orders of the actual corporate owner, standing right in front of him. I looked down at my brother struggling helplessly on the floor beneath the heavy boots of my security team and calmly watched the final moments of his fabricated empire bleed away into the cold, hard reality of the marble floor. Jason was still writhing beneath the heavy boots of the private security team when a loud, booming crash echoed from the back of the grand ballroom. The massive solid oak double doors previously closed to seal in the exclusive reception were thrown forcefully wide open. A sudden rush of freezing night air swept through the lavish space, disrupting the sickeningly sweet scent of the imported white orchids. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows lining the eastern wall, the harsh, frantic glare of flashing red and blue lights began to bounce wildly against the crystal chandeliers. The synchronized strobe effect illuminated the terrified faces of the Atlanta elite, casting long, chaotic shadows across the silk tablecloths. The local authorities had completely barricaded the perimeter. Stepping through the grand entryway was Attorney Harrison, exuding the same terrifying, predatory calm I had witnessed in his corner office. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests, emblazoned with sharp yellow lettering, supported by a squad of uniformed local police officers. Their heavy utility belts clattered against the pristine marble floors, a stark and violent contrast to the delicate string instruments resting abandoned on the stage. Harrison walked with the absolute certainty of an executioner carrying a royal decree. The sea of wealthy guests scrambled backward, parting instantly to create a wide, clear path for the advancing officers. Naomi's relatives huddled together, shielding their faces from the flashing police lights reflecting off the glass, utterly horrified by the sheer magnitude of the law enforcement presence at what was supposed to be a high society celebration. Harrison halted directly in the center of the dance floor, standing just a few feet away from where Jason remained pinned to the ground. He reached inside his tailored breast pocket and produced a thick stack of legal documents sealed with official judicial signatures. He did not yell, but his deep, commanding baritone easily reached every single corner of the silent, terrified room. He announced that he held active federal arrest warrants issued by the United States District Court. He looked down at my struggling brother and clearly stated the charges: wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit federal financial crimes. He handed the primary warrant directly to the lead federal agent, authorizing them to immediately take Jason and Patricia into federal custody. The reality of the federal warrants hit my mother with the devastating force of a physical strike. Patricia, the woman who had spent the entire evening parading around in rented diamonds and taking credit for a fraudulent empire, completely shattered. Her legs gave out from under her. She collapsed heavily onto the hard marble floor, the expensive fabric of her mother-of-the-groom gown bunching up around her trembling knees. All her manufactured grace and arrogant superiority vanished in a single instant. She let out a loud, visceral wail that echoed painfully through the ballroom. It was not the elegant, restrained crying she usually employed to garner sympathy from her country club friends. It was the raw, ugly sound of a cornered criminal realizing her life was entirely over. Patricia crawled forward on her hands and knees, reaching her shaking arms out toward me. She begged me to stop the officers, sobbing that she was my mother and that I could not possibly send my own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary. She screamed that she would pay me back every single cent, completely ignoring the fact that she had absolutely no assets to her name. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had happily sacrificed my future for her own vanity, and I felt absolutely nothing. As the federal agents stepped forward with handcuffs drawn, my father Richard realized his entire world was burning to ash. His distinguished patriarchal facade evaporated. Desperation completely overrode his logic. He scrambled away from Patricia's sobbing form and rushed toward the center of the room. He raised his hands defensively, shouting at the federal agents to stop claiming there had been a massive administrative misunderstanding. Richard frantically announced to the entire ballroom that no crime had been committed because I had given my full legal consent for the massive loan. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his voice cracking with panic. He loudly declared that I had signed a retroactive guarantor ratification form just before the ceremony, legally absorbing the debt and absolving the family of all liability. He demanded that I open my purse and show the officers the legal document I had taken from him in the service corridor, foolishly believing that his manipulative trap was his ultimate salvation. I slowly reached into my designer purse, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my terrified father. I retrieved the folded legal document and held it up for the room to see. I calmly reminded Richard that I had specifically told him I needed my reading glasses to review the paperwork. I told him I never signed anything without reading it first. I unfolded the heavy paper, revealing the completely blank signature line at the very bottom of the page. The collective gasp from the Atlanta guests was deafening. Richard's face turned ash white. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing silently as the absolute finality of his failure washed over him. He had unknowingly handed me the physical proof of his own active involvement in the conspiracy. Attorney Harrison stepped smoothly between me and my father, shielding me with his imposing professional presence. He snatched the unsigned ratification document from my hand, inspecting the fine print with a cold, predatory smile. Harrison looked directly at Richard and delivered the final devastating legal blow. He informed my father that presenting a fraudulent financial document to a victim and attempting to trick them into signing away their legal rights was not a defense. It was a severe compounding felony. Harrison explicitly detailed that coercing a signature to retroactively cover up a massive federal wire fraud constituted witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and active collusion. By handing me that document in the hallway, Richard had legally upgraded his status from a passive bystander to a primary co-conspirator. Harrison turned to the second federal agent, handing him the blank ratification form to be bagged as physical evidence, and calmly suggested that the officers might need to request a third pair of handcuffs. The second federal agent did not hesitate. He reached to his heavy utility belt and unclasped a pair of thick steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound sliced through the heavy silence of the grand ballroom, sounding infinitely louder than any music played that evening. The venue's security team hauled Jason off the polished marble floor, forcing him aggressively onto his feet. His bespoke velvet tuxedo jacket, ripped at the shoulder seam from the initial physical takedown, hung awkwardly on his frame. His perfectly styled hair was completely disheveled, instantly ruining his carefully curated billionaire aesthetic. The federal agent grabbed Jason's wrists violently, twisting them behind his back. The steel cuffs locked into place with a terrifying, absolute finality. Jason squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in rapid, frantic denial, whispering over and over that this had to be a terrible nightmare. Patricia remained collapsed on the floor, surrounded by the pooling silk of her incredibly expensive mother-of-the-groom gown. A local police officer approached her, towering over her trembling, pathetic form. He ordered her to stand up immediately. Patricia could barely support her own body weight. She sobbed uncontrollably, her heavy professional makeup running down her face in dark, ruined streaks. The rented diamonds around her neck glittered wildly under the flashing red and blue police lights filtering through the tall conservatory windows, highlighting the absolute absurdity of her fabricated wealth. The officer grabbed her arms, pulling them firmly behind her back. Another sharp click of locking metal echoed across the massive room. The matriarch of our family, the woman who had spent 33 years demanding absolute perfection and ruthless social climbing, was officially in federal police custody. The lead federal agent stepped forward, his voice completely devoid of any emotion or sympathy. He began reciting the Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the heads of the 200 elite guests. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Hearing those iconic, devastating words spoken in the middle of a high society wedding reception was incredibly surreal. The Atlanta elites watched the scene unfold in pure, unadulterated horror. They clutched their designer purses and half-empty champagne flutes, completely paralyzed by the spectacle of the golden boy and his narcissistic mother being stripped of their freedom. Richard stood frozen near the head table, watching his wife and son get shackled. He looked down at his own trembling hands, waiting for the third set of cuffs Harrison had promised. He was a broken, defeated old man who had gambled his entire life on a criminal lie and lost everything. The shock paralyzing the room finally broke. Naomi's father, a prominent real estate magnate in Atlanta, pushed his way to the very center of the dance floor. His face was a tight mask of absolute fury and deeply offended pride. He pointed a thick, accusing finger directly at my handcuffed father. "You filthy, pathetic con artists!" he roared, his voice trembling with pure, unbridled rage. "You dared to bring my daughter into your criminal filth. You dressed yourselves in stolen money and fed us garbage wrapped in gold." He turned his attention to the wider room, addressing his extended family and the remaining VIP guests with absolute unwavering authority. "This marriage is completely invalid. There will be an immediate annulment filed first thing Monday morning. My daughter has absolutely no legal or personal ties to this den of thieves." Naomi let out a loud, agonizing shriek from the head table. Her father's booming declarations severed her last desperate hope of clinging to the lavish lifestyle she thought she had permanently secured. She collapsed against the back of her chair, burying her face in her hands, thoroughly ruining her flawless bridal makeup. The devastating reality of her digital footprint suddenly hit her with the force of a physical blow. She screamed at her bridesmaids to cut the video feeds. 5 women in matching silk dresses scrambled frantically across the ballroom floor. They grabbed the ring lights, knocked over the electronic gimbals, and frantically tapped on their smartphone screens, desperately trying to delete the active live streams. But the internet moves far faster than a panicked bridal party. The damage to her micro-influencer reputation was already permanent and entirely irreversible. Thousands of her loyal followers had watched the federal agents march into the venue. They had seen the giant projected bank statements detailing the fraud. They had heard my voice clearly announcing that her custom-beaded wedding dress was purchased with a stolen Social Security number. Screen recordings were already circulating rapidly across multiple social media platforms. Her high-paying sponsors would inevitably drop her by morning. Her personal brand, built entirely on projecting an image of effortless luxury and elite status, was permanently branded with felony wire fraud. She was socially and financially ruined. Through all the screaming, the frantic scrambling, and the wailing pleas of my family, I remained sitting in my wooden folding chair in the drafty back corner. I maintained a state of ice-cold detachment. I did not smile, and I did not gloat over my victory. I simply watched the inevitable consequences of their actions unfold, with clinical, detached precision. Patricia turned her tear-streaked face toward me as the officers began marching her toward the main double doors. "Clara, please?" she begged, her voice hoarse and incredibly desperate. "I am your mother. You have to stop this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please do not let them take me away to a prison cell." Jason thrashed against the iron grip of the federal agents, twisting his head wildly to look at me. "Fix this!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he struggled. "You have the money. You own the venue. Just pay the loan and drop the charges. You owe me this. You owe the family." I ignored their desperate, pathetic pleas completely. They were dead to me, mere ghosts of a past I had finally excised from my life. I reached out and gently placed my hands over Leo's eyes, shielding my innocent son from the ugly, violent reality of his relatives being dragged out of the grand ballroom in heavy steel chains. I kept his noise-canceling headphones securely in place, ensuring he heard absolutely nothing of their toxic screaming and desperate begging. He leaned comfortably against my chest, completely safe and entirely protected from the chaos unfolding around us. I stared blankly at the massive double doors as the local police and federal agents escorted the screaming bridegroom and his sobbing mother out into the freezing night air, their expensive shoes stepping directly over the discarded, useless hot dog on their way out of my venue. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of swift, mechanical federal justice. When a prosecutor is handed a case wrapped in a flawless bow of high-definition audio recordings, digital IP logs, and signed venue contracts, the legal system grinds forward with terrifying efficiency. Jason and Patricia were dragged into federal court wearing standard-issue orange jumpsuits, a jarring departure from their bespoke velvet and custom-tailored silk. The judge, wholly unimpressed by their tears and their arrogant pleas for leniency, denied them any chance of a quiet release. Because the wire fraud involved crossing state lines to secure the venue funds, and the identity theft was aggravated by familial manipulation, the prosecutor aggressively pushed for maximum penalties. My brother and my mother were staring down the barrel of severe federal prison time, looking at a decade behind bars with zero possibility of early parole. The financial devastation hit them long before the judge could even strike a gavel. The moment the fraud was officially confirmed by the lending institutions, Jason and Patricia had their credit scores completely annihilated. Their bank accounts were frozen by federal investigators. Every single credit card in their wallets was aggressively declined and permanently canceled. The fabricated kingdom of wealth they had lorded over me for my entire adult life dissolved into a mountain of crippling legal debt. They had traded their freedom for a single night of fake luxury, and now they were paying the ultimate agonizing price. My father Richard managed to avoid handcuffs that night, but his punishment was arguably just as devastating. As the designated patriarch who had tried to legally cover up the felony, his reputation was thoroughly destroyed. But his true ruin came from trying to save his wife and his golden boy. Federal criminal defense attorneys require massive upfront retainers, especially when defending cases with irrefutable digital evidence. To afford even basic legal representation, Richard was forced into complete financial liquidation. He had to fire sale the sprawling Connecticut suburban home he loved so much, watching the bank snatch it up for pennies on the dollar. He completely drained his extensive retirement accounts, absorbing massive tax penalties, just to get the liquid cash required by the law firm. The distinguished man, who had pulled me into a service corridor to manipulate my signature, was now functionally bankrupt. The last update I received from Attorney Harrison confirmed that Richard had moved all of his remaining possessions into a tiny, run-down rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. He had traded his manicured lawns and country club memberships for a cramped, drafty living space with peeling paint and a leaking roof. He was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing reality of his own enabling behavior. Naomi experienced a different but equally catastrophic kind of destruction. Her furious parents returned to Atlanta that very night, dragging their humiliated daughter behind them. They engaged their own ruthless legal team and filed for an immediate annulment. Because the marriage was entirely predicated on massive financial fraud, the judge granted the annulment with brutal record-breaking speed. Naomi's legal ties to Jason were severed, but the permanent stain on her public image was impossible to erase. Her entire micro-influencer brand went up in flames practically overnight. The internet is a ruthless place for those who fake their lifestyle, and her comment sections became an unrelenting war zone of mockery. Followers meticulously dissected every single post she had ever made about Jason's limitless wealth, turning her boastful videos into viral jokes. Her lucrative corporate sponsors dropped her immediately, refusing to associate their products with an unindicted co-conspirator to federal wire fraud. She was permanently exiled from her elite social circles in Atlanta. The high society friends who had eagerly drank the stolen vintage champagne now refused to return her calls, treating her like absolute poison. Naomi was forced to delete all of her social media platforms and disappear into complete obscurity, her vanity entirely crushed by her own arrogance. While their worlds burned to ash, my life remained peacefully intact. But Richard refused to accept his defeat quietly. Throughout those 3 weeks, my secure voicemail inbox steadily filled with desperate, panicked messages from my father. I would sit in my quiet, safe office listening to his voice break as he begged me to save them. He pleaded with me to contact the federal prosecutor and claim it was all a giant family misunderstanding. He begged me to tell the authorities that I had authorized the loan verbally, desperately asking me to commit perjury to rescue my abusers from a prison cell. How? When begging did not work, Richard resorted to the classic toxic manipulation he had used my entire life. He left breathless voicemails invoking the sacred bond of family. He cried into the phone, reminding me that we were blood, that family is supposed to protect each other no matter what. He tried to guilt-trip me by describing Patricia's declining health in the county holding facility and Jason's overwhelming despair. He repeatedly stated that a daughter should never turn her back on the people who raised her, attempting to twist my survival into an act of cold-blooded betrayal. I sat at my desk and listened to every single message with ice-cold detachment. I did not feel a shred of pity or a single ounce of guilt. I simply took notes, forwarding every voicemail to Attorney Harrison to add to the mounting pile of evidence against Richard for witness tampering and harassment. His desperate pleas for family loyalty were nothing but hollow words from a man who had watched me struggle for years and done absolutely nothing to help. The concept of blood meant absolutely zero to the people who had gladly stolen my identity to fund a party. I let his voicemails play out into the silent room, his frantic begging serving as the ultimate soundtrack to their spectacular downfall. I deleted the audio files from my personal device right after forwarding them. The sound of his desperation was no longer my burden to carry. Their ruin was a cage they had built entirely by themselves. I unlocked my phone screen and navigated directly to my contact list. I found the digital card labeled with my father's name. I did not leave a final dramatic parting voicemail. I did not send a lengthy text message explaining exactly why he had failed so spectacularly as a parent. I simply pressed the block contact button. A small confirmation prompt appeared on the screen, asking if I was absolutely certain I wanted to prevent this person from reaching me. I confirmed the selection without a single microsecond of hesitation. I went a step further and configured my network settings to automatically reject all unknown numbers. The absolute, impenetrable boundary of no contact was officially finalized. The digital silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever experienced in my entire life. My phone was no longer a weapon they could use to inflict guilt or demand salvation. It was just a quiet piece of glass and metal. I set it down on my desk, stood up, and prepared to enjoy the evening with the only person in the world who truly mattered. The scene shifted dramatically from the cold, sterile environment of my corporate office to the warm, golden glow of a private dining room inside a heavily guarded Michelin star restaurant in downtown Boston. The establishment was famous for its exclusivity and its uncompromising dedication to culinary perfection. There were no imported floral arches masking the scent of deceit, and there were no fake aristocrats parading around in rented diamonds. The atmosphere was incredibly intimate, grounded in genuine quiet luxury. I sat across the table from my 7-year-old son, Leo. He was wearing a sharp dark blue blazer, looking every bit the handsome young gentleman I was raising him to be. A distinguished waiter dressed in a pristine white uniform approached our private table. He did not carry a cheap paper plate, and he certainly did not look down at us with arrogant disdain. He offered a warm, highly respectful smile as he carefully placed a heated porcelain plate directly in front of Leo. Resting perfectly in the center of the dish was a beautifully seared bone-in ribeye steak resting on a bed of roasted garlic puree and glazed spring vegetables. It was the absolute finest, most expensive cut of meat the renowned restaurant offered. I had personally requested the executive chef to prepare it exactly to Leo's liking. My son picked up his fork and knife, his eyes widening with pure, unadulterated joy as he took his first bite. He chewed happily, swinging his legs slightly under the heavy linen tablecloth, completely insulated from the federal criminal proceedings currently dismantling his grandmother and his uncle. He looked up at me with a bright, genuine smile, declaring it was the best dinner he had ever eaten. I smiled back, reaching across the table to gently wipe a small drop of sauce from his chin. I promised him that from now on, he would only ever be served the absolute best. He would never again be pushed into a dark corner, and he would never again be made to feel like an unwanted burden. I leaned back in my plush velvet chair and turned my gaze toward the expansive window overlooking the glittering city skyline. The towering skyscrapers sparkled against the dark night sky, standing as massive monuments to ambition, structure, and endurance. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the profound absolute peace of the moment wash over me. It was the kind of deep cellular tranquility that only arrives after you finally excise a massive malignant tumor from your body. Cutting it out involved a brief, intensely painful surgical process. It required precision coldness and the willingness to shed a part of yourself that had been growing inside you for decades. But once the toxic mass was completely removed and the incisions were firmly stitched closed, the relief was entirely life-saving. For 33 years, I had allowed society to dictate the definition of family. I had bought into the dangerous manipulative lie that sharing identical DNA somehow mandated a lifetime of unconditional forgiveness. I believed that biological relation was a sacred contract, requiring me to absorb endless abuse, financial exploitation, and public humiliation just to keep the peace. Sitting in that dining room, watching my son thrive in a safe, secure environment, I realized how incredibly toxic that philosophy truly was. Family is not determined by a genetic lottery or a shared last name. Family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering protection, and actions that demonstrate genuine care. Blood simply makes you related. Loyalty, honesty, and safety are the actual metrics of family. Patricia, Richard, and Jason possessed my blood, but they behaved like ruthless parasites. They gladly sacrificed my financial security to fund an illusion, showing zero hesitation when pushing me and my son into the dirt to elevate themselves. Letting them face the brutal, uncompromising wrath of the federal justice system was not an act of vicious revenge. It was an act of extreme self-preservation. I had refused to set myself on fire just to keep my abusers warm. I looked back at Leo, who was now excitedly asking the waiter about the dessert menu. My heart swelled with an intense, fierce protective instinct. I had successfully defended his future. I protected the financial resources that would pay for his university education, his first home, and his ultimate security. The empire I built was completely safe, locked behind an iron wall of boundaries that no narcissistic relative could ever breach again. They often say that burning bridges leaves you stranded on an island. They warn you against destroying the pathways back to where you came from. But as I sat there enjoying the exquisite taste of absolute freedom, I realized the conventional wisdom was entirely wrong. Sometimes setting fire to a highly toxic, rotting bridge is the single best decision you can ever make. The massive, roaring flames do not leave you stranded in the dark. The fire actually illuminates the path ahead, providing the light you desperately need to walk away from the ashes and build a magnificent kingdom entirely on your own terms. Has there ever been a moment in your life where you had to stand up against your own blood relatives to protect the people who truly matter? Have you ever had to burn a toxic bridge to light your way forward? Please share your story in the comments section below. I read every single one of them. Do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories about claiming your power and walking away from the shadows. Thank you for watching, and remember, your peace is worth protecting at absolutely any cost. The story powerfully illustrates the devastating impact of toxic family dynamics and the profound courage required to break free from them. For too long, society has perpetuated the dangerous myth that blood ties demand limitless forgiveness and endless sacrifice. We are conditioned to endure manipulation, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse simply to maintain the hollow illusion of a perfect family tree. However, as the narrative vividly demonstrates, true family would never force you to set yourself on fire just to keep them warm. When those closest to you exploit your vulnerabilities, diminish your achievements, or actively steal your future to fund their own narcissistic vanity, they irrevocably forfeit the right to call themselves family. The ultimate act of self-preservation and empowerment is recognizing that walking away from toxicity is not an act of cruel betrayal, but a vital triumph of self-worth. Setting immovable, ironclad boundaries is absolutely essential for protecting your peace of mind, your hard-earned assets, and the well-being of the innocent people who genuinely rely on you. Sometimes the most liberating and life-saving decision a person can make is to permanently stop seeking validation from individuals who are fundamentally incapable of offering it. We often fear the fallout of severing these deep-rooted connections, but burning a bridge built on deceit and exploitation does not leave you stranded in the dark. Instead, the flames of that severed connection illuminate the path toward a healthier life, built on authenticity, mutual respect, and genuine love. We must normalize the difficult choice of excising toxic elements from our personal lives, regardless of the traditional familial titles they hold. Take a moment today to evaluate your own boundaries and have the courage to walk away from any relationship that costs you your peace.